This haunting melody establishes the mood for our confessional prayers. For the sin we have committed by not serving God with joy and gratitude, and for the sin we have committed by not recognizing friends and loved ones in need of psychological or emotional support, and for the sin we have committed by stigmatizing people, especially those with a mental illness, and for the sin we have committed by not dedicating enough resources to addressing mental health for our poor, for our youth, our veterans, ourselves, for the sin we have committed by not seeking out a mental health professional when in need, and for the sin we have committed by living in a society where suicide is the #1 cause of death in Delaware among our 10 to 14-year-olds. For all these sins and for all so many more, dearest God, forgive us, pardon us, grant us atonement. You never know what lies beneath the surface of your fellow congregants. I take congregational confidentiality very seriously. And during most of this sermon, I am withholding names of the subjects of the stories I wish to share with you. But in this first story, my subject wants me to share her name because she wants to be a resource person to you. She has created an organization to help you. Most importantly, she wishes to remove the stigma often associated with mental health conditions. Please, meet one of our newest congregants, Sue Rosenstock. Sue, could you stand up for us, please? You have to look all the way in the back to find Sue. All right, thank you, Sue. Not long after meeting Sue last year, she started giving me educational material and a car magnet for an organization she helped create called UMTTR, You Matter. As a meaningful response to the suicide of her 16-year-old son, Evan, Sue created You Matter, along with her son's friends. Evan was the very last person you would expect to take his own life. He was caring, helpful, smiling, compassionate, an athletic young man. At Evan's funeral, Rabbi Adam Raskin wrote, "There are hypotheses and speculations, but how and why the mind works is still such an incredible enigma. How did it happen that Evan's mind turned a blind eye to all this love and support on that fateful Monday morning? What was this inscrutable cloak that descended over his awareness, that no matter what pain he was suffering, no matter what was terrorizing him, that there would always be another way, another answer, another source of relief and comfort, anything but this, anything but the answer he was deceived into believing was the only way out? We will never have the answers, dear friends." Sue was emphatic in explaining to me that Evan, on the surface, was the least likely person in the world to succumb to suicide. Quick note, Sue has taught me never to use the phrase commit suicide. She says, we commit murder. We commit robbery. Suicide is a manifestation of overwhelming sadness, of being entirely overwhelmed by pain. To use the verb commit is to wrongly accuse the victim of being a criminal. The takeaway from Rabbi Raskin's eulogy was his reference to the story told in Numbers, chapter 11, of Moses being overwhelmed by his own disillusionment, frustration, and pain. As Moses approaches God in total exasperation, God says to him, "Lo tisa ata levadecha." You do not have to bear this alone. God tells Moses to appoint 70 elders from the tribes of Israel to help him bear the burden of leadership. Sue has made it her life's work through You Matter to ensure that students, parents, teachers, and counselors know that they are part of a greater community of caring people, that they matter. She gives us all tools to help recognize people who might be in need of emotional support. As a first step towards connecting to people with mental health challenges, please take a moment to learn the 5 signs with me. They are, and I'm going to ask you to please repeat them after me. 1, personality change. 2, agitation. 3, withdrawal. 4, poor self-care. And 5, hopelessness. Personality changes. The individual is different. You may notice sudden or gradual changes in the way that someone typically behaves. 2, agitation. You may notice the person has more frequent problems controlling his or her temper, or seems irritable or unable to calm down. 3, withdrawal. Someone who has been socially engaged may pull away from family and friends and stop taking part in activities he or she had enjoyed. 4, poor self-care. You may notice a change in the person's level of commitment to themselves, to the way he or she looks, or there's poor judgment. And 5, hopelessness. Have you noticed someone who had been optimistic and now can't find anything to be hopeful about? That person may be suffering from extreme or prolonged grief, or feelings of worthlessness or guilt. If you recognize these or similar signs in yourself or in someone you care about, get help. You connect, you reach out, you inspire hope, and you offer help. Mostly, you can show compassion and caring and a willingness to find a solution when the person may not have the will or the drive to help him or herself. There are many resources in our communities. In fact, in the bulletin I've given you today, I provided links with contact information for several such organizations. One of the most important values in Judaism is pekuach nefesh, saving a life. At Yom Kippur, we are proud to say that no matter how important fasting is on this day, it is actually a sin to fast if you're pregnant, elderly, taking medicine, or ill in any way. On a public service announcement from the White House, former First Lady Michelle Obama, oh, how I miss her, she said that mental health is just as important as physical health, and that 1 in 5 Americans suffers from a mental health condition. The point of her message, in part, was to remove the stigma from mental health illnesses so people can get the help they need. The First Lady stressed the need for fellow Americans to reach out to those requiring mental health care. Again and again, the message from all quarters is to reach out. In Hebrew, keruv, to make a connection, a kesher to those who need our help. We have focused so far on the stigma of mental illness, and we're now increasingly aware of the connection between this and drug addiction, particularly opioids. I've been hearing more reports of the opioid crisis facing our country, and it was reported recently that every day 140 American citizens die due to overdoses from opioids. 140 fellow Americans every single day. It makes sense then that the president recently declared the opioid crisis as a national emergency. Focus has been placed on the type of medicines which are being prescribed over and over again, and frequently these medicines can lead to either overdose or addiction. I think what is lacking in the conversation are questions like, how do people stay healthy given societal pressures? And why are people taking these opioids in the first place? For many, it is the treatment of pain, but pain is not just physical. It is also emotional psychological, even spiritual. This type of pain is just as real as the physical injuries you actually see. I spoke with one of our congregants who was a trusted nurse in our community. She told me about a colleague of hers who recently lost her job for redirection. The nurse explained to me that her colleague was redirecting the opiates she was to give to her patients to herself, administering these powerful drugs between her fingers, absorbing the drugs through her skin. I asked our congregant, why? And she told me to numb herself from all the pain she had to absorb in her job. All too often we seek numbing from our job, or a terrible problem in our family, or a destructive relationship, or possibly just the onslaught of information. Too much disinformation, just too much. The human brain was never designed to absorb all the stimuli at once. The TV is on, the iPhone is on, the computer is on, we are bouncing from screen to screen to screen. It is just too much. On these special days, in this congregation, I have some very favorite moments. I can't get enough of the cantor's rendition of Kol Nidrei. I look forward to the choir stirring Unatana Tokef. I always like hearing from our leadership and from our guest speakers. And you know what, for me, is the best part of the High Holy Day services? It's those silent Amidas. Silence. A time to reflect. Not a lot of time, but during Yom Kippur, in those 25 hours, there's time to be quiet and reflect. To remove our heads from the 24/7 flow of news and nonsense. Maybe what we require is a Shabbat. Not just a Shabbat of Shabbatot, Yom Kippur, but a weekly Shabbat to turn off the fire hydrant of incessant information from iPads and laptops and smartphones and just reflect. And if you come to shul, not just reflect, but reconnect, to make a kesher between you and others, because you cannot do this thing called life all by yourself. As God reminded Moses in his time of greatest need, Lo tisa ata levadecha, you do not have to bear this alone. I recently spoke with a teenager in this community going through her own mental health challenges. She told me that this business about connecting to others is more important than I might have realized. She said what helped her the most when she was feeling at her lowest was the very Jewish notion that if you save the life of just one person, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. She shared that even if she, God forbid, contemplated taking her own life, she wouldn't, because there's always one person, just one person, who might be able to use her help. And if not for her sake, then for that other person's sake, she must stick around. It's about making a kesher, a connection between yourself and another person. For her, that idea has been life-saving. A friend of mine, a fellow rabbi, is suffering with terrible addiction. He says you are never cured of your addiction. Rather, it is a constant battle. For him, being cut off or feeling cut off is when he is at his most vulnerable. Part of his treatment involves sharing feelings, honestly and openly in multiple groups. In Hebrew, we might call these groups kehilot, or communities. It is where the power of the minyan, the quorum of 10, speaks such power, especially to those in mourning, or those looking for God, or just looking for humanity. In his groups, when my rabbinical friend feels connected, he finds strength. He worries about all the addictions in our society: alcohol, food, sex, drugs, gambling, and yes, even iPhones. Do you ever look around in a waiting room or at the airport, on public transportation, or even as people are walking, or worse yet, driving, and they are glued to that smartphone? It's an addiction. I tell you, it's an addiction. He maintains it's all about a need for endorphins, those feel-good chemicals our brain produces in order to fight isolation. We can produce endorphins by low-tech, positive, personal ways. We need to make kesher, reaching out, a real priority. However, before we can reach out, we need to be able to reach in. We need to be able to take care of ourselves. As the first century Rabbi Hillel said in Pirkei Avot, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" Of course, he also goes on to say, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? It turns out Judaism has been sensitive to psychological self-care for a long time. When I was at Jewish summer camp, one of the first songs I learned was Gesher Tzar Meod. You may know it. Kol Olam Kolo, Gesher Tzar Meod, Gesher Tzar Meod. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, and the most important thing is not to be afraid. These words were written by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. Reb Nachman suffered from terrible depression all his life. He would move himself to ecstatic states of joy through singing and dancing, and encouraged his followers to do the same. Another rabbi, Rabbi Nachman Stillerman, while still a boy, once asked the late Rebbe's mother, "What is your son, Rabbi Schneerson's, favorite prayer?" And the response was, Modeh Ani. Modeh Ani is a simple prayer of gratitude we are supposed to say every morning when we awake. The Rebbe explained that the message of this prayer is that God has a lot of faith in us. So let's not disappoint him. How do we know that he has a lot of faith in us? Because he gave us another day of life, even though he doesn't owe it to us. If God is willing to validate our existence by waking us up each morning, shouldn't we also believe in ourselves as well? Early in my rabbinate, I used this understanding to help a fellow Jew I met whose drinking and subsequent automobile accident landed him in the detox unit of a local hospital. I went to his hospital bed. I was rather scared. I was right out of rabbinical school. I didn't know what to say. So I explained and translated Modeh Ani. Then with my guitar in my hand, even back then, I sang the prayer, which he taped on his cassette recorder. He listens to it every morning, and he claims it has helped keep him sober. There's a wonderful psychological treatment, perhaps inspired by the Jewish idea that positive thinking can lead to positive actions. It's called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. The process, led by a trained therapist, helps the patient, 1, identify and change thinking patterns, 2, impact feelings, and 3, push for positive behavioral change. Singing, "The whole world is a very narrow bridge, and the most important thing is not to be afraid," or Modeh Ani Lefanecha, are both Jewish examples of trying to alter negative thinking with the intention that will lead to positive behavioral change, including reducing pain, both physical and psychological. I believe Judaism historically long favored DBT as an aid to psychological health long before it was actually introduced in the late 1980s. Everyone in this congregation has his or her own stories. It could be a Sue Rosenstock finding meaningful ways to live her life after the suicide of her son. It could be a teen struggling with paralyzing anxiety. It could be a Jewish professional struggling with addiction. It could be Reb Nachman of Breslov, who struggled with depression all his life. It could be any one of you. It could be me. We all have burdens to bear. On this Kol Nidrei evening, let us resolve to be more available to one another. Let us resolve to destigmatize mental health problems. Let us resolve to dedicate ourselves to daily positive thinking as found in some of our most precious prayers, including Modeh Ani. Let us resolve to learn the 5 signs: personality change, agitation, withdrawal, poor health, and hopelessness. Let us resolve to demand of our elected politicians that they encourage psychological aftercare for our servicemen and women as they do pre-war readiness. Above all, let us resolve in this new year to really try to reach out to one another, to really learn each other's stories, to truly make a kesher between one another. I will leave you with 2 last thoughts and a blessing. First, from time to time, we all need a checkup from the neck up. Secondly, in the word illness, if we replace the I with the word we change illness to wellness. And finally, the blessing, Tzom Kal. May we all have a meaningful and highly reflective fast. Good Yom Tov.